This video is going to introduce you to the very basics of DSLR or just an SLR camera operation. This is for the beginner, someone who just is starting and is ready to switch it off of fully automatic mode and maybe start experimenting with some of the other features and settings on the camera. So this video we're going to talk about ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, f-stop. So that's what this is going to cover. So let's get started. These three things all work together to create exposure of your images. So the ISO, the shutter speed, and the f-stop or the aperture all work together. It's a combination of those settings that will determine whether you have proper exposure or not proper exposure. It could be too dark, it could be too light. So to begin with, we'll talk about ISO because it's sort of the most fundamental perhaps. ISO is basically the sensitivity of the sensor, or in the old days the film, the sensitivity to light. So the higher the ISO, the more sensitive it is. The lower the ISO, the less sensitive it is. There's not a lot of creativity involved in picking your ISO. So you can pick your ISO in order to do creative things with f-stop and shutter speed. But you do need to know that the ISOs, generally speaking, the higher the ISO, the lower the resolution. So if you have the ability to set your ISO very, very high, it's probably going to introduce distortion, artifacts, noise, whatever you want to call it, into your image. So ISO is the sensitivity of the image sensor that's going to capture actually the image. The next two features are shutter speed and f-stop. Now shutter speed is an easy concept to understand. It is the speed at which the shutter opens and closes, and it's measured in fractions of a second usually. Very rarely will you actually be measuring shutter speed in seconds, although there are applications where that happens. So shutter speed is usually a fraction of a second. Now that means that the bigger the number on the bottom of the fraction, the less the shutter is open. So if it's open for a half of a second, that's 1/2. A half of a second is open longer than 1,000th of a second, which is 1/1000. So if the number on the bottom is bigger, that means that the shutter is opening and closing more quickly. It's the shutter speed is the fraction of time, the fraction of a second that the shutter is open. Now obviously, the faster the shutter opens and closes, the less light that's going to come in. So the less light that comes in is going to adjust the exposure. So if the exposure is too bright, you can increase the shutter speed to a faster setting, and that will make the shutter speed, that'll make the amount of light coming in less and make the exposure more appropriate. The other concept is a setting called f-stop or aperture. They're used interchangeably, saying it has this f-stop or it has aperture of this. This is a little bit more of a technical setting. It has to do with the geometry, it has to do with ratios of the focal length of the lens and the diameter of the iris. The iris is actually the thing that opens and closes. So to understand aperture, you have to visualize the little mechanism that opens and closes inside the camera, which it's inside the lens, and then it looks something like this. So here's what the iris looks like. In order to film this, I set the shutter speed for 10 seconds so that it would open and the iris would dilate and show, you could see it in the inside the lens. Usually it's going, in and out so fast that it's hard to see. So here you can see one setting, and I changed the setting. The second setting is 7.1, whatever, if that means anything. So in the second setting, it closes a whole lot more than the first setting. You can see the difference in the size of the aperture, the size of the opening. So this was the two different f-stops. So that's how aperture works. That's how the iris closes and opens, and whatever you want to call it, to let the light in. So the larger the aperture number, the less light that's coming through. The f-stop is usually represented as a number like 1.4 or 2.5 or 5.6 or something like that. And it's a ratio of that lens setting. So the focal length of the lens and the diameter of the iris. The thing that you need to understand about it, you don't need to understand the math and the geometry and all of that, but what you need to understand is that the bigger that number, the less light that's coming in. So usually if you see it in a detailed or very technical, it'll be 1 colon that number, and it's a ratio. So it's a ratio of the focal length to the size of the opening. So if that number is bigger, then it's like a fraction. So 1 over 16, if you have an f-stop of 16, is less light than 1 over 8. So if you have an f-stop of 8, 8 is more light than 16, and 4 is more light than 8. Now, with shutter speed, it makes really good sense to say if I have a 60th of a second and a 30th of a second, that's half as much light. 1/30th of a second is going to let in twice as much light as 1/60th of a second. That's not the case with aperture. Because it's a ratio of diameter of the opening, and then the amount of light that comes in is a function of the area of the opening, there's going to be a square function to it. It's going to be exponential. This is why we take algebra, so we can understand f-stops on our camera. So if we go from f2, which is very open, to f4, because there's an area involved and it's not just linear, the amount of light is actually, when we double the f-stop, the amount of light is cut by a fraction of 4. So 2 is 4 times as much light as 4, 4 is 4 times as much light as 8, and so on and so on. 16 is 1/4 as much light as 8, 32 is 1/4 as much light as 16. So that's it. Those are the 3 settings. You don't have to memorize all the math about it. What you do need to understand is that, in summary, the higher the ISO, the more sensitive the sensor. The higher the fraction of shutter speed, the less light that's coming in. So 1/60th is less than 1/30th, 1/500th is less than 1/200th. And the larger the f-stop, the less light that's coming in. So if your exposure is too dark, you want to use a smaller f-stop and a smaller shutter speed and a larger ISO. If it's too bright, you want a smaller ISO, a larger shutter speed, as in 1 over 160th versus 1 over 80. Or you want a larger aperture. 8 is larger than 4. So those are the 3 basic settings on the camera that are going to account for exposure in the camera. Thank you for watching. This is the first in a series of these kind of videos, and hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button. Share the video with someone else who maybe is new to DSLRs, and subscribe to the channel if you want to keep up with updates and things like that. So thanks for watching.